This is a slightly more advanced lesson about gerbs, metal spark gerbs. In the chemicals lesson, intro, I did not discuss metals and metal sparks. I was unsure whether I was even going to get to using any metals in Fireworking 101. But a couple upcoming projects, specifically the wheel using gerb drivers and the chromatrope using gerb drivers, those projects really benefit from having some metal sparks in the later stages of the device display. A wheel that starts with charcoal gerbs, very graceful, elegant, soft, somewhat dim, reddish gold charcoal gerb sparks is very pretty. And then if that transitions to a second stage of metal spark gerbs, which are more dramatic, they're more bold, they're brighter. It's a very nice, effective transition, and it captures the audience's attention more than just going from, say, one stage, 30 seconds of charcoal gerbs, to a second stage of 30 seconds of charcoal gerbs. Trying to keep an audience's attention for 60 seconds of the same effect gets a little difficult. They get a little bored. Whereas transitioning after the first 30 seconds to a more bold, dramatic metal spark effect is very effective. In Heart, I pointed out that the charcoal spark gerb formula is formula number 3 in Heart. Formulas 1 and 2 are metal spark gerbs. Formula 1 is a steel spark gerb. Formula 2 is a titanium spark gerb. Both of them use the same base comp, 52-13-9, potassium nitrate, air float commercial charcoal, and 9 sulfur. That equates to a 70-18-12 composition ratio, which is slightly slower than our fastest, hottest black powder composition ratio of 75-15-10. This is 70-18-12 ratio, so slightly slowed down. 5% less potassium nitrate, 3% more charcoal, 2% more sulfur. So the fuel is increased by 5% and the potassium nitrate oxidizer is reduced by 5%. Slightly slower than hot black powder base composition. To that 52-13-9 is added 26 parts to round up to 100 of a metal, either the steel filings or titanium metal particles. That equates to adding 35% to the base 70-18-12. If we have 100% of the base composition, we're essentially adding 35% of the metal. It's a lot of metal in there. It really creates a bright shower of sparks. So I thought that going ahead and addressing metal spark gerbs was a good idea for a next step. We are getting into experiments a little bit. I'm going to experiment with 5 different metals that I have on hand. The Fireworks Cookbook carries some metals that I'll be specifying as possible metals that could be used in a metal spark gerb. One of my mottos is love the experiments. One of the real attractions to fireworking is learning some basic techniques, and then within known safety guidelines, going ahead and experimenting. What will this metal do in that gerb? What would that metal do in the gerb? Comparing the effects and seeing which we like best. So there's some possible experimenting possible in here. I think I kind of know what metal I'm going to focus on using, but I'm going to try 5 different metals and video them, and we'll see which one we like best. I know that I'll pick one that I like best, and if you experiment, you can pick one that you like best. But that all has to be done within certain safety parameters so we don't get in trouble with some safety hazards to using metals. Metals introduce some safety hazards that just using potassium nitrate, charcoal, and sulfur don't entail. I mentioned in the safety lesson Tom Peregrine's Introductory Practical Pyrotechnics. One of my first introductions to the idea of experimenting with different metals is in the star formula section of IPP. And he discusses Dave Blesser's blonde streamer star composition, which is essentially chrysanthemum 6. That's even a more slow charcoal star composition. It's the one we're going to use when we get to making stars. And he discusses the addition of 18% ferrotite to that composition to create blonde, bright, yellow, almost white sparks with ferrotitanium. He also mentions that other metals can be used. There's a range of metals we can use when adding metal sparks to a star composition, or specifically to these gerbs that we're going to be making. The metals that are often referred to as possibilities for being used in fireworking devices are iron. That has the chemical symbol of Fe. It is a iron is an element. It's just single atom element iron. Steel is sometimes used. I have some sparkler grade steel, 60 to 200 mesh sparkler grade steel. Steel is an alloy quite often of iron plus carbon, and perhaps with some other elements in there for stainless steels and other metal alloys. But steel is an alloy of iron plus typically carbon. And carbon makes a nice branching yellow gold spark. Titanium is sometimes specified. Titanium is a very durable, hard, non-rusting, non-reactive metal. It doesn't rust or oxidize easily. I have titanium knees. I got knee replacements and my knees are made of titanium. It can be a very hard, it is a very hard metal. It comes in a couple different forms. Titanium sponge, if you under a microscope looked at a particle of titanium sponge, it looks like a sponge. It's very porous and has jagged edges all over it. Spherical titanium looks like little BBs. If you open it up, it looks like a tub of little perfectly round BBs, very small. So titanium is sometimes specified. Ferrotitanium is very often used in stars and other devices where we want a pretty gold and silver spark effect. Ferrotitanium is a mixture of iron, Fe, ferrous refers to an iron-bearing metal. FeTi, we often call it ferroti. Ferrotitanium is an alloy of iron and titanium. Whereas iron, one of the drawbacks to using iron or steel is that they rust. If they are in a composition, especially a damp composition, for very long, they can rust. If we use them and we're going to store them for any length of time in a composition or in a device, we have to treat the iron or steel, and that's often done with either paraffin wax or linseed oil. I'm not going to get into how we treat those metals to protect them. I typically make devices right away and use them. I don't store devices for a long time. Ferrotitanium, the iron in the ferrotitanium is somewhat protected by the titanium, which is a non-rusting metal. So ferrotitanium, although it can rust somewhat over time and lose some of its effectiveness, it's less reactive than iron or steel because it is somewhat protected by the titanium in the alloy. Magnesium, especially in older compositions before magnesium came into vogue, magnesium was used to create very bright white sparks. The disadvantage of magnesium is that it very violently reacts with water. It can react with other chemicals in a damp composition. I personally don't use magnesium. I try to avoid the hazards of using magnesium completely. But magnesium, which is an alloy of magnesium and aluminum, is rendered relatively inert by the aluminum. The aluminum is a much less reactive metal, protects the magnesium in the alloy. Magnesium is often specified in bright color stars or for bright silver sparks. It's a non-reactive metal that can be used in a damp composition, whereas magnesium alone couldn't be used. So magnesium is another metal that is often specified in our compositions. For sparking gerbs and sparky stars, iron is sometimes used, although not very much anymore, because it does have to be, iron or steel is not used very much because it has to be coated to protect it from reacting with things in the composition. Some folks do get iron grindings where they grind disc brakes and drum brakes and end up with the grindings, and that can make for very nice sparks in gerbs and stars. So some folks do get iron from that source and do use iron or steel, sometimes treating it in advance if it's going to be stored for very long. Titanium is used a lot for sparks, ferrotitanium, aluminum, and the magnesium. I personally right here have an array of sparkler grade steel, ferrotitanium, which is the iron and titanium. I have spherical titanium alone. I have a magnesium, and I have aluminum. I'm going to make 5 gerbs, one with each of those metals in it, to see how it looks. I mentioned some dangers when we introduce metals into a composition. The degradation of iron or steel is a danger in that it will lose its effectiveness. It'll turn from iron to rust. Oxidized iron is an iron oxide. It's red iron oxide or black iron oxide is an iron oxide. It's essentially rust. If we have iron or steel in a composition for any length of time and it's not been treated, it can rust and lose its effectiveness. There is the danger of sparking. If we take a sparking metal, iron, steel, titanium, ferrotitanium, and we grind them together, the particles together very harshly, if we bash them together, we can create a spark under the wrong conditions. We want to avoid sparking hazards. Aluminum and magnesium don't spark, but titanium, ferrotitanium, steel, and iron can spark. So we have to do certain things to make sure we're avoiding any sparking, which would naturally ignite our composition. There is the reaction with water of either the steel or iron or magnesium if we were to use it, so I avoid magnesium with water, and if I'm going to use iron or steel and store it for any length of time, I would coat it with wax or linseed oil. If our metal particles are large and or rough, like sponge titanium would be rough, or if we use very large particles, and we're going to be hand ramming gerbs, we don't want large, rough particles that are going to get knocked against each other, potentially sparking, potentially causing enough friction to ignite the composition. So the particle size is important to take into consideration, and also the roughness of the particles. I specifically don't use sponge titanium. I don't use large granular metals. All the metals I'm going to be trying in this project are either 30 mesh or smaller or 40 mesh or smaller. So everything is a pretty small mesh size. Another danger that comes when we use metals for sparks in compositions is the burning sparks hitting the ground. Large metal particles will burn for a long time, and since especially our fountain sitting on the ground, if that is shooting out large burning metal particles, those can come back down and hit the ground burning. We don't like to see any sparks hitting the ground when our devices display, so especially with the gerbs, I'm going to use smaller mesh particles to prevent the burning particles from coming down and hitting the ground. So those are the dangers we can encounter. How am I going to avoid those dangers? I'm not going to store devices for a long time, especially devices that contain the sparkler grade steel or the ferrotitanium. If I was going to store those devices for any length of time, I would find ways. I would read the books, and I would pick other people's brains on the forum on how to treat these metals with melted paraffin wax or linseed oil. I'm going to avoid sponge titanium. Another danger and another thing to avoid is a really wet composition with really fine aluminum in it and sulfur and potassium nitrate. That can create hydrogen sulfide gas. Smells like rotten eggs. It's poisonous. Conceivably, the compositions can heat up and self-ignite. So we don't want to use a large amount of water with a really fine aluminum, like a 325 mesh, flake aluminum, and sulfur and potassium nitrate. So I'm going to avoid that mix. We're very slightly dampening these compositions. The only aluminum I'm going to use is 30 to 60 mesh granular, so I'll be avoiding that hazard. To avoid some of the hazards, especially with aluminum reacting with potassium nitrate and sulfur, we can dissolve a little boric acid in our wetting water. That's often done when we're working with glitter star compositions. So that's another way to head off the reaction between aluminum, sulfur, and potassium nitrate. I'm going to avoid magnesium completely. I'm going to use fine metals, less than 30 mesh in size. My metals are going to be a smoother shape than sponge. They're going to be spherical, little round BBs. They're going to be granular, which is just a small, slightly irregular shaped particle. I'm not going to use sponge metals. And I'm also going to emphasize, as I demonstrate ramming one of these metal spark gerbs, some extra safety precautions to take into account and put into effect when we are ramming gerbs with metals in them. I'm going to wear gloves, a glove on that left device holding hand all the time. I'm going to ensure that there's absolutely nothing flammable around me. I'm going to avoid any grinding of the tooling base on the tabletop or anything when I try to settle a composition. I'm going to be aware that there are metals in the compositions, and I'm going to avoid any possible way of igniting the compositions. It's just very important to be aware that when we move from charcoal compositions to compositions that contain metals, we introduce some safety factors that have to be taken into account, and we have to use some additional safety measures. There are some sources for a lot of these chemicals. These are metals that I had on hand. The Fireworks Cookbook, I looked through their selection of what metals they have that could be used in these gerbs. They have an 80 mesh to 325 mesh spherical aluminum. A round spherical aluminum is much less reactive than a flake. That could conceivably create some nice sparks if aluminum proves to make a nice spark in these gerbs. They do carry a 60 to 325 mesh ferriti. I'm going to be using a 40 to 325, so the ferriti they carry is very close to what I'm going to be using. That minus 60 to 325 ferriti from the Fireworks Cookbook would make very nice sparks. They carry a magnesium 30 to 60 mesh, the same as what I'm going to be using. I also carry just a straight 60 mesh magnesium, which would be a little bit finer than this mix of magnesium that I'm using. And they also carry a titanium powder that's 325 mesh to 120. What I'm going to be using is a minus 40. There is some fine stuff in there. I don't think it probably gets down to 100 mesh though. So their titanium is a mix of some slightly coarser bits than I am using, ranging down to some finer bits that I am using. But I think that minus 325 to 120, if the spherical tie proves to be an appealing gerb, would also be very functional in the gerbs. When I'm mixing the composition, I am going to be emphasizing a couple differences in the way I mix the composition. I have printed out the formulas in a couple of different volumes, a couple of different quantity batch sizes for the metal spark gerbs. This is from fireworking.com. This is the basic formula that Hart uses in the 1 and 2 gerb compositions in the book. This specifies the 52% potassium nitrate, 13% charcoal air float, 9% sulfur, and 26% metal particles. I am going to screen mix, as I demonstrated in the screen mixing lesson. I'm going to screen mix the non-metal parts of the composition, the potassium nitrate, charcoal, and sulfur. That's going to be screened and mixed very homogeneously. I'm then going to dampen that with 1% water of the weight of those three chemicals. When I dampen with 1% this time, I'm not going to take into account the weight of the metal particles because they don't absorb any moisture. So I'm going to dampen with 1% of the weight of the 3 screen together chemicals, dampen the composition, screen the composition, get the moisture thoroughly distributed through the comp, and only then do I add the metal particles to the dampened composition and shake it. I have determined, through a little trial and error, that one of these gerbs will require 85 grams of the total composition. That total composition, 85 grams minus the 22 grams of metal, results in 63 grams of the non-metal ingredients. So 10% of that is 0.6 gram. I'm going to add about a half a gram or so, 0.6 gram of water to dampen the base composition, screen to distribute the moisture, and then add the metal. Since I'm going to try 5 different metals, what I'm actually going to do, 5 times 85 is a total of 425 grams of composition to make 5 gerbs. I'm going to screen together and dampen the total weight of the non-metal composition in this, and then I am going to weigh whatever 85 minus 22, 83, 60, 63. I'm going to weigh 63 grams of that dampened composition and add 22 grams of one of the metals and ram a gerb. Then I'll weigh out 63 grams of the dampened base composition and add 22 grams of a different metal, shake it in, ram that metal gerb, and I'll label the gerbs as I go. So that is how I'm going to mix the compositions. The reason I add the metal at the very end and only shake it in is I do not put metal particles through my good screens. They can clog the pores, they can stay stuck in there, they can contaminate future compositions that get screened through those screens. So I never put metals through my screens. So I am only going to screen mix the non-metal ingredients, screen mix them completely, dampen them with 1% of that weight by water, then add the metal and simply shake it in. That is the safe, correct way to mix the composition for these metal spark gerbs. I think that is everything I wanted to cover before we actually mix some composition and start ramming some of these 5 experimental gerbs. So just to be real clear about the metals I will be trying in these 5 gerbs, I'll also be filming one of the original charcoal gerbs as a baseline video to compare the metal spark gerbs. I have some steel sparkler grade steel, 60 minus 60 to 200 mesh. There's nothing in here larger than 60 mesh. This is originally from Skylighter. It says it's coated. I don't know what it's coated with, but that might already be treated with something to keep it from rusting. I have some minus 40 mesh ferrotitanium. There's nothing in here larger than 40 mesh. It's a pretty fine powder. I can feel the bits between my fingers. But this is minus 40 mesh down to some really fine stuff. I know that this makes really nice sparks. I have 30 to 60 mesh magnalium. This is a coarser product. It's also lighter. It's less dense. This is a slightly coarser product, but nothing larger than nothing larger than 30 mesh magnalium on down to 60 mesh. I've got minus 40 mesh, which is a pretty fine mesh, spherical titanium. This is little titanium balls, very fine, and nothing larger than 40 mesh in there. And I have 30 to 60 mesh granular aluminum. This is nothing larger than 30 mesh on down to 60 mesh, and it's a granular, fairly coarse aluminum. So none of these is reactive with metal. None of these is a large, coarse particle, and I am going to exercise the precautions that I'll demonstrate when I'm ramming the gerbs with these 5 metals. So I've printed out my metal spark gerb formula with 425 grams of the composition. That is 5 times 85 grams. I know it takes 85 grams approximately per gerb for these metal spark gerbs. I subtracted the 111 that the metal particles would be in that composition. That leaves 314 grams of non-metal composition. I weighed and screen mixed those individual chemicals, the potassium nitrate, air float, commercial, mixed hardwood charcoal, just a sparky, slow charcoal, and sulfur. I've screen mixed those, and now I'm going to dampen them. I know that 314 grams times 0.01, 1%, is 3 grams of water I want in here. There we go. 2 grams. Still 2 grams. And now I'm up 3 plus just a little bit, which will be fine. I'll screen this to completely integrate the moisture. By the way, I did, when I weighed and screen mixed the chemicals, I did double check the weight to make sure I had the 314 grams of comp, and I did. So I did double check my weight. A lot of this will be the exact same process as when ramming one of the charcoal gerbs, so I won't spell out all of the ramming procedures except for the ones that are different for the charcoal spark gerbs. I'll just go ahead and ram one of these real quick and point out the differences as I go. That's now a nice non-dusty but still free-flowing composition. Just very slightly damp. Doesn't even really hold together well when it's squeezed, but it's just non-dusty. I'll shake that one more time. Now I've also printed out the Metal Spark Gerb formula for the 85 grams that'll go into each gerb, and that will require 22 grams of the particular metal that I'm using and 63 grams of the non-metal ingredients. So what I'm going to do is weigh 63 grams, tear the scale, weigh 63 grams of the non-metal ingredients. I'll set this base comp aside. Now I want to weigh 22 grams of one of the metals. I'll start with the sparkler steel. I'm going to mark my tube with that so I don't forget which metal I'm ramming in this one. And I want to weigh 22 grams of this sparkler steel. Tear the scale first with my little measuring cup. 22 grams. Put that in the tub and shake that up real well. Let me get a okay. I'm not going to put this through a screen. I don't like to put metals through my screens. I think just shaking that metal into that relatively free-flowing composition will be just fine. As I said, there are just a couple things I'm going to do differently when I ram this gerb with the metal composition in it, metal sparks in it, metal particles in it. And I'll point out those differences as we go. First thing is, I don't anticipate any ignition. I've never had an ignition. I don't know anybody that's had an ignition when ramming a gerb. But I sure don't want to be the first one to have one and have a bunch of stuff sitting around like black match or stars or black powder or open composition. So I'm really, and I always religiously limit the amount of stuff I'm exposed to, but I'm really limiting the amount of any explosives or flammables that I'm exposed to here. I am going to religiously wear my, naturally my eye protection, wear a glove on my left hand. If something were to ignite in this while I'm ramming it, if there's composition in there, it'd blow the rammer out the top, start flaming. I'd get the heck out of here. The door to my shop is slightly ajar so that I can hit it and get out of here real quickly. I'm assuming you've watched the safety lesson and the lesson on making gerbs. Here's my composition with the steel in it, and I do have steel written on the gerb. I'm going to put a heaping scoop in there for the first scoop. I'm really going to pay attention to my do not pass line. I don't want to pinch any composition between the end of this solid rammer and that spindle tip. Another thing, when I was working with the charcoal, one thing I am going to do is pretty religiously close this tub of composition when I'm ramming an increment. When I was doing leveling an increment of gerb composition, charcoal spark gerb composition, I was feeling free to just waggle this around on the work table. It's remotely possible I'm going to get a little composition with some metal particles on this work table. I don't want to be grinding those particles between the tooling base and the work table. Lloyd Sponenberg, a well-respected professional fireworker who hangs out in fireworking.com, sent me a little private message to remind me of that, especially when I get to working with metal spark gerbs. So to level that composition, I'm just going to go like this. I'm using the long solid-ended rammer. This is also one of the practices I'm going to do with the metal spark gerbs. I'm lifting the rammer in and out a few times to make sure that all the composition is down below the rammer. There's not any between the tube and the rammer where it would get ground if there's particles, metal particles in between the rammer and the tube when I'm ramming. Metal particles can be a little bit harder naturally on the rammers than charcoal spark composition would be. So I want to get all that composition down below the rammer. I'm going to tap it a couple times lightly, pick it up, make sure there's none between the rammer and the tube. Now I'm going to ram it with my 8 rams. Slightly rounded scoop. Close the tub tightly. Waggle it without grinding anything. Push the rammer in a couple times. A couple light taps. Do that again. Now, those are all the extra little safety precautions I'm going to use when making these metal spark gerbs. Now I'll just proceed as I did before with the charcoal spark gerbs. One increment at a time. Fill the tube up. I suppose another good tip to point out is that when I am scooping the composition out of here, even trying to avoid any friction, grinding with the metal particles in there, I heard when I scooped that composition scoop out, a little bit of grinding of the spoon on the bottom of the tub. I like to avoid that too. Just scoop it out without grinding the composition between the spoon and the bottom of the tub. This is a damp black powder composition. None of the metal particles are large or rough. I absolutely don't anticipate any problems or sparking or anything when making these gerbs, but it doesn't hurt to recognize that the metals in there are increasing the sensitivity of the composition, and just to look for every place to reduce any friction and grinding between anything, the spoon and the tub, the rammer, the tube, the spindle base, and the work table. Just recognize we're working now with a slightly more sensitive composition, and use some, they're actually common sense precautions, just to exercise awareness of all that as we now work with the metal composition. The effect that's produced by the metal, that's why I won't be grinding my tooling around. The effect that's produced by the metals, the metal sparks, is really worth the extra trouble of using the metals. It really adds a dramatic effect to a fireworks device. I'm sure that way back when, 1,000 years ago, before metals were common, especially finely ground metals, everybody made do with charcoal sparks and had a good time doing it. You can make a wide array of all these devices without using metal particles. They're not necessary but they are pretty. If I was on a deserted island with only some palm trees to make charcoal with, some potassium nitrate in the hold of the airliner that wrecked, and some sulfur in there too. I could have a lifetime's worth of fun just making charcoal spark devices. But I happen to have a bunch of metals in my chemical collection, so why not do some experimenting to see what kind of effects we can produce with these gerbs, with wheel drivers, with chromotrope drivers. So I'm getting to the end of the composition. I'll ram a clay bulkhead, and I will make 4 more of these gerbs, 1 each, with each of the remaining 4 types of metal particles. And then when it gets dark, we'll do some filming and see what kind of effects we get. And there we go. Metal spark gerb number 1, steel. Thought I'd add a little something. Quite often, if a metal is going to react with water or other chemicals in a composition while you're working with it, while you're ramming it, you'll smell it or you'll feel it heating up. If I start to smell hydrogen sulfide, if I start to feel heat being generated by a composition, I'm going to get it outside first quickly, set it real quickly in a safe location, and hose it down with some fresh water. Dilute it. Get rid of it. There is one other nifty creative option to making these gerbs, and that's to make a color changing gerb. Whenever we're doing something color changing, it's preferable to go from the dimmer color to the brighter color, so the eyes don't have to adjust after looking at a bright color when it goes to a dim color. Much easier for the eyes to adjust when they look at a dim color, like a blue going to a red, or going from a charcoal spark comp to a, say, a ferrotite comp. So I'm going to make 2 color changing gerbs. They'll burn half, the first half, which is at the nozzle end, The first half will burn charcoal, then it'll color change to ferro-tie. I decided to make 2 of them because it's a little easier for you to make full batches of composition. So I mixed a full batch of the charcoal composition, that is dampened, and I mixed a full batch of the ferrotitanium metal spark composition, that is dampened. Now I'm going to split those 2 in half and use half of each in the 2 gerbs. The charcoal composition was 60 grams, so I'll put 30 grams in a separate tub. Just easier to keep track of everything if I split them in half and use half for the one gerb, then half when I come to the second gerb. There's 30 grams of the charcoal and 30 grams of the charcoal. I'll do the same with the ferro-tie. The metal spark came to 85, so that'd be 42 would be half. That tears to 0. 42. And I've got 42. Half and half of the ferro-tie gerb. What I'll do is ram my gerbs as I have been, but I'll ram the first half at the nozzle end with the charcoal, then I'll switch to the ferro-tie, and then I'll do the second gerb the same way. And I'll video those tonight too and demonstrate what the color changing gerb looks like. As I'm ramming the first half of the charcoal gerb composition in this first gerb, I thought of another creative option for making these color changing gerbs. That is to have a pulsating gerb. Have a gerb that burns charcoal spark and then metal spark, and then charcoal spark and then metal spark. Since the flame front in the gerb doesn't burn flat on up, it burns a little bit concave in the fuel grid, the propellant grain on up. I don't want real thin increments of the various compositions. They'll just sort of get muddled and blended together. I think if I was going to make a pulsing gerb, I would go 2 increments of charcoal, 2 increments of metal, 2 increments of charcoal, 2 increments of metal until I'm done. That way I'd have about 1 idea of each color in there. Maybe I'll do that for the second one of these, and I'll show a pulsating gerb. 2 increments of charcoal, 2 increments of ferro-tie, 2 increments of charcoal, 2 increments of ferro-tie, 2 increments of charcoal. Show a pulsating effect. That would be fun. Like I said, half the fun in all this is experimenting within safe guidelines. What I did for making the pulsing gerb was, after the nozzle was rammed, I introduced 2 increments, 2 scoops of the charcoal gerb. That half of the composition that was set aside for this gerb, I used 2 scoops of that, and I marked down those 2 scoops as I introduced them into the gerb. It's really easy. Maybe I'm not that bright. It's really easy for me to lose track of what I just put in there. How many of those did I put in there? So I put down the 2 scoops that I put in there of the charcoal gerb as I put them in, marked 2 scoops of the metal gerb as I put them in, and I observed all my safety precautions as I was working, keeping the tubs closed and observing all the safety precautions, especially for the metal comp as it was rammed. 2 scoops of charcoal, 2 scoops of metal, 2 scoops of charcoal, and 2 scoops of metal. So this gerb should burn charcoal, tie, charcoal, tie, charcoal, tie. And I'm glad it's ending with a bright spurt. So we'll see what that looks like. I bet it's going to be awfully nice. Not tie, but ferro-tie. I used ferro-tie in that comp. This is number 1, the charcoal gerb. Just very pretty and delicate. This will be number 2, the aluminum gerb. I'd have to guess that slagged up at the end there. Really heated up the inside of the tube, which is now burning. The spark started off nice, but did not end very nicely at all. This is number 3, the steel gerb. Very pretty. Delicate orange sparks coming out low, fine down at the bottom. Then a nice steady plume of branching golden orange sparks. Very nice. This is 4, magnalium. Normally magnalium sizzles and pops and crackles as it burns. I had to wonder if that one was going to blow. That was definitely melting and slagging, melting the magnalium, slagging up the nozzle. Started off nice, sizzling, but whew, really got fierce toward the end. This is number 5, titanium. Titanium also normally pops and crackles while it burns. Brilliant popping plume of sparks. Nice even burn all throughout. This is number 6, ferroti. I always enjoy ferroti sparks. They're not as brilliant as the titanium, but they're very pretty, nice and bright. Should give a very nice effect. Yeah, very smooth plume, consistent. Not as bright silver white as the tie, sort of a an off-white straw blonde sort of look, but really, really nice. This is a number 7, the color changer. The first half will burn as a charcoal spark gerb. The second half will burn as a ferrotitanium gerb. Very nice effect. Graceful and pretty and subtle to start with, and then a nice high, tall, gosh, a good 12-foot tall, pretty ferrotitanium plume. And this one should pulse between the charcoal and ferrotitanium. Oh yeah, very nice effect.